Walker on here. They both will be monitoring chat. After the presentation, we will try to answer any questions that anybody has. So if you want to put those in the chat, they will be monitoring that. Today, we're going to talk about the best practices of preserving food, canning, the water bath canning, and pressure canning, also drying and freezing. Canning, freezing, and drying are the three main methods of preserving food. The method you use depends on the type of food you are preserving, the cost, the space you have to store the food, and whether or not there are safe guidelines for a specific method for a particular food. Whether you are canning, freezing, or drying, there are practices that will help you preserve food so that it will be safe to eat and maintain quality. Most fresh foods have a high percentage of water, which makes them very perishable. They will spoil or lose their quality because of growth of undesirable microorganisms, physical damage, and chemical changes. Microorganisms live and multiply quickly on the surfaces of fresh food and on the inside of bruised, insect-damaged, and diseased food. Physical damage also can cause food spoilage. Bruising and punctures cause food to spoil, as well as water loss and wilting. Chemical changes occur in food that cause spoilage and loss of quality. Enzymes that help foods grow and mature continue to work on food after harvest, causing flavor and texture changes. Food also reacts with oxygen and loses quality. Choose foods at the appropriate maturity stage, depending on the process you use, and process them at the peak of their quality. This is usually within 6 to 12 hours of harvest. Some fruits may need to be ripened. Apricots, nectarines, peaches, pears, and plums should be ripened 1 or more days between harvest and canning. Keep produce in a shady, cool place if you have to delay canning. Remember that canning or other methods of preserving food will not improve the quality of an inferior food. Fresh home-slaughtered red meats and poultry should be chilled and canned without delay. Do not can meat from sickly or diseased animals. Ice fish and seafood after harvest and can them within 2 days. There are certain practices you should follow when canning foods, as well as for freezing and drying. Always begin with good quality fresh foods. Examine the food carefully and select foods that are not damaged, moldy, or bruised. Damaged produce provides opportunities for harmful microorganisms to penetrate the outer surface of the food. After you carefully select the food, wash it thoroughly to reduce the microbial load, which is the total number of bacteria and fungi in a given quantity of water or soil on the surface of food. Reducing it reduces the chance that food will spoil or lose quality over time. Some fresh foods will need to be peeled. Whether or not a food has a peel can affect the processing time needed to kill harmful microorganisms. Follow the directions in the recipe. You will often hear extension agents and USDA recommend up-to-date methods and tested recipes. Methods and recipes have been updated as manufacturers have offered newer equipment for home use, and as we have had opportunities to test processes to be sure they are safe. USDA recommends that you follow recipes developed after 1994. Older publications may have unsafe processes. There are several good sources of recipes. So Easy to Preserve is available from the University of Georgia. The USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning can be downloaded from the internet. And the UT Extension Canning Foods publication is available through UT Extension workshops. Canning guides published by other universities are also reliable sources. Be careful about recipes you find on the internet and old family recipes, for they may not be safe. There are 3 types of foods canned: acidified, acid foods, and low acid foods. The amount of acid in a food, or the pH, determines what type of canning method you use and how much heat you need. In the case of acidified foods, you can add an acid to the product or increase the acidity through fermentation. There are 3 types of canners recommended for canning food at home: the boiling water canner, the atmospheric steam canner, and the pressure canner. The boiling water canner and atmospheric steam canner are designed for acid foods such as fruit, jams and jellies, pickled foods, and salsa. They reach a temperature of 212 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the temperature of boiling water. Pressure canners are designed for low acid foods such as vegetables and meat. These reach a temperature of at least 240 degrees Fahrenheit. Pots with multiple cooking functions are all the rage right now. Some advertise these as canners. We do not recommend using these for canning for several reasons. Because you may not be able to fill the pot with enough water to cover the jars needed for safety when processing acid foods. Once the lid is closed, you will not know if the water is at a steady boil, which is needed for safety. For low acid foods that are processed in a pressure canner, you have no way of knowing if the temperature inside the pot is high enough to reach 240 degrees Fahrenheit under pressure. If jars of food have to be placed on their sides to process, there will not be enough room for steam to circulate between the jars, so they will not reach a safe temperature and pressure. And you do not know if that pressure remains steady for the entire processing time. Laboratory testing has shown that temperatures inside these pots can vary by model and brand. As altitude increases, water boils at lower temperatures. The lower temperatures are less effective for killing bacteria. Pressure must be increased in a pressure canner, and process time must be increased in a water bath canner when you are at an altitude of over 1,000 feet. Recipes in So Easy to Preserve and the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning are for an altitude of 0 to 1,000 feet. Once you determine your altitude, you make adjustments. Charts are available in these guides for adjusting time or pressure for higher altitudes. Most canning publications ask consumers to consult with their local extension office. An alternative source of information is the local district conservationist with the Soil Conservation Service. Using the right jars and self-sealing lids will help ensure that your jars will not break under high temperatures used in canning, and that you will create a good quality seal. You may find that people like to reuse mayonnaise jars. These are typically designed by manufacturers to be used once. You also may weaken these jars when you use utensils to remove the contents. Old jam, pickle, mayonnaise, and peanut butter jars may not have the right kind of surface around the top of the rim needed to form a seal with the 2-piece lids. It is recommended that you use jars that are designed for canning. These are designed to be reused and to withstand high temperatures without breaking. Just check each time you use them that there are no cracks and there are no nicks on the rims that will prevent a good seal. Wash the jars in soapy water, rinse well, and keep them hot. This can be done in a dishwasher or in the water that is heating in your canner. Keep the jars hot to prevent breakage when they are filled with hot product. Jars that will not be processed for 10 minutes in a water bath canner or atmospheric steam canner should be sterilized in boiling water for 10 minutes. Jars that go in a pressure canner do not need to be sterilized. Use 2-piece lids and follow the manufacturer's instructions for pre-treating. Most need to be simmered in a pan of water and then left in the hot water. You may also see advertisements for other kinds of lids. They may work fine, but we do not have information on how well they perform in laboratory tests, so we cannot recommend them. Antique jars with zinc lids and wire bale jars are not recommended. They look nice, but these types of seals may fail and food will spoil. Many foods need to be hot packed. This means the food is cooked before it is packed in the jars. This removes air from the food, shrinks the food, helps keep the food from floating in the jars, increases the vacuum in sealed jars, and improves shelf life. You can add more product to the jar when you remove the air and it shrinks. Recipes may have only a hot pack process, or they may have a hot and raw pack. In a raw pack, the food is unheated before it is packed into the jars. If you have directions for both, it is okay to choose either one. If you have directions for only a hot pack process, then you should not do a raw pack. The headspace is the unfilled space above the food in the jar and below its lid. When you fill the jars with product, you should leave an appropriate amount of headspace. The amount of headspace depends on the product. Jellied products have a 1/4 of an inch headspace. Fruits and tomatoes have a 1/2 inch headspace. Foods processed in a pressure canner need to have from 1 to 1 1/4 inch. The space is needed for expansion of food as jars are processed and for forming vacuums in cooled jars. The extent of expansion is determined by the air content in the food and by the process and temperature. Air expands greatly when heated to high temperatures. The higher the temperature, the greater the expansion. If jars are too full with too little headspace, the contents may boil out during processing. If too much headspace is left at the top of the jar, then the processing time may not be long enough to drive out all the extra air. You may not get a tight vacuum seal. Air inside the jar can also discolor the food. Be sure to check the headspace provided for each process. A water bath canner is a large covered cooking pot with a rack. You can use any large metal container as long as you have enough room to cover the jars with at least 1 inch of boiling water and with 1 inch of airspace for a brisk boil. The diameter of the bottom of the pan should be no more than 4 inches wider than the diameter of the stove burner. Do not use a large kettle that fits over 2 burners. The jars in the middle may not get enough heat. The canner needs to have a flat bottom for electric ranges. Smooth top stoves may not be designed for the weight of a canner with jars and water. Consumers should check with the manufacturer before canning on a smooth stovetop. The canner needs to have a tight-fitting lid and a rack. The rack keeps the jars from touching the bottom of the canner and allows water to circulate freely. Before you start preparing your food, fill the canner half full of clean hot water. Preheat the water to 140 degrees Fahrenheit for raw packed foods and to 180 degrees Fahrenheit for hot packed foods. Begin preparing the food for the jars while the water is heating. Pay attention to proper headspace, wiping rims and releasing excess air. Load the canner 1 jar into the rack at a time using the jar lifter. Be sure not to tilt the jars, as this can cause food to spill into the sealing area of the lid. Add more water as needed, enough to cover jars with 1 to 2 inches of water. Prepare an extra pan of water and keep it heated to add to the canner as needed. Set the heat to the highest position, cover the canner, and heat until the water boils vigorously. Start timing at that point. If the water stops boiling at any time, turn the heat on its high setting, bring back to a vigorous boil, and begin timing the process over from the beginning. When the jars have been processed for the recommended time, turn the heat off and remove the canner lid. Wait 5 minutes before removing the jars. Using the jar lifter, remove the jars one at a time, being careful not to tilt them. Place the jars onto dry towels or a cooling rack to prevent them from making contact with a cold surface that may cause breakage. Let them sit undisturbed away from cold drafts. Don't cover or wrap them in towels. Let them sit undisturbed for 12 to 24 hours. Do not tighten ring bands on the lids or push down on the center of the flat metal lid until the jar is completely cooled. Pressure canners have been redesigned through the years. Models made before the 1970s were heavy-walled with clamp-on or turn-on lids. The thick walls meant that the canners took more time to depressurize and cool. Some people like to use old canners passed down through the family or purchased at antique shops or flea markets. The problem with this is there may not be instruction manuals that describe how to use them safely. You also may need to replace parts, which can be difficult to find depending on the brand. Old rusted dial gauges need to be replaced when they are damaged or do not provide accurate readings. It is difficult to test these for accuracy, and you may not find a suitable replacement. Today, pressure canners are thin walled kettles with a jar rack, a gasket, dial or weight gauge, an automatic vent cover lock, a vent port, which is also a steam vent, to be closed with a counterweight or weighted gauge, and a safety fuse. Most have turn-on lids instead of lids that have to be clamped down. Use only canners that have the Underwriters Laboratory UL approval to ensure their safety. They are actually safe if used correctly. The safety fuse will pop out if pressure is too high. Once you lock the lid down with the vent cover lock, it stays locked until the pressure goes down. The gasket in the lid should be handled carefully and cleaned according to the manufacturer's direction. Nicked or dried gaskets will allow steam leaks during pressurization of canners. Gaskets in older models may require a light coat of vegetable oil once per year. Gaskets on newer models are pre-lubricated and do not benefit from oiling. Check with the canner's instructions to see if a particular gasket is lubricated. Lid safety fuses are thin metal inserts or rubber plugs designed to relieve excess pressure from the canner. Do not pick or scratch fuses when cleaning lids. Parts can be replaced by ordering them from the manufacturer or from stores offering canning equipment. Be sure to have the model number to get the right parts for the canner. Weighted gauge models exhaust tiny amounts of air and steam each time the gauge rocks or jiggles during processing. They control the pressure and do not need checking for accuracy. The sound of the weight rocking or jiggling indicates that the canner is maintaining the recommended pressure. The disadvantage of weighted gauge canners is that they cannot be corrected precisely for higher altitudes. At altitudes above 1,000 feet, they must be operated at a canner pressure of 10 instead of 5, or 15 instead of 10 psi. Some people like to use the dial gauge because they feel more confident when they can see the dial on the correct number. But these need to be watched to see that it does maintain a constant pressure. It is important that they be checked for accuracy before each year. USDA does not have recommendations for canning foods in a small pressure cooker. The recommendation for using USDA pressure processes for low acid foods is to use a canner that holds at least 4 quart-sized jars. The research for USDA pressure processes for vegetable and meat products was conducted in pressure canners that are most similar to today's 16-quart or larger pressure canners. Pressure cookers have less metal, are smaller in diameter, and will use less water than pressure canners. The result is that the time it takes the canner to come up to processing pressure, that is, the come-up time, and the time it takes the canner to cool naturally down to 0 pounds pressure at the end of the process, known as the cool down time, will be less than for the standard pressure canner. The come up and cool down times are part of the total processing heat that was used to establish USDA process times for low acid foods. If the heat from the come up and cool down periods is reduced because these times are shortened, then the heat from the process time at pressure alone may not be enough to destroy targeted microorganisms for safety. That is, the food may end up underprocessed. Underprocessed low-acid canned foods are unsafe and can result in foodborne illness. Some manufacturers may offer process directions for pressure cookers. Consumers using this equipment will need to discuss processing recommendations with those manufacturers. The USDA and National Center for Home Food Preservation recommendation is not use them for canning with our processes. Today's pressure canners are safe to use, but there are 2 serious errors that can occur in temperatures obtained in a pressure canner. First, when you live at a higher altitude, the internal canning temperatures are lower, so you need to correct this by canning at a higher pressure. Second, air trapped in a canner can lower the temperature and result in underprocessing. This is why we exhaust the air through the vent for 10 minutes before we add the weight to cover the vent port. To vent a canner, you leave the vent port uncovered and heat a filled container with the lid locked in place. As the water boils, it generates steam through the vent port. When the steam begins to escape, set a timer for 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, close the vent port by covering it with the weight. To use the pressure canner, you will need to put 2 to 3 inches of hot water in the canner unless the process calls for more water. Place filled jars on the rack using the jar lifter. Keep the jar upright at all times and fasten the lid securely. Leave the weight off the vent port. Heat at the high setting until steam flows freely from the vent port. Let steam escape continuously for 10 minutes. Then place the weight on the vent port. The canner should pressurize in the next 3 to 5 minutes. Exhausting the air is very important. Processing times are determined with air exhausted from the canner. Begin timing the process when the weight starts to rock or jiggle, or when the pressure gauge reads the correct pressure. Regulate heat for steady rocking or jiggling motion or proper dial temperature. For the dial gauge canner, let pressure rise quickly to 8 pounds, adjust temperature down slightly, and let pressure continue to rise. For the weighted gauge canner, let the canner heat quickly until steam begins to escape from gauge or begins moving. Adjust heat down slightly until it jiggles or rocks according to the manufacturer's directions. When the timed process is complete, turn off the heat, remove the canner from the heat if possible, and let the canner depressurize. Do not force cool the canner. It can warp the canner, it can cause loss of liquid from the jars, and seal failures. When the vent lock piston drops to normal position, it has depressurized. After the canner has depressurized, remove the weight from the vent port. Wait 10 minutes, unfasten the lid, and remove it carefully. Lift it away from you. Remove the jars with a lifter and place them on a towel or a coolant rack, leaving at least 1-inch spaces between the jars during cooling. Let jars sit undisturbed at room temperature to cool for 12 to 24 hours. Drying is another method of preserving food, and like other methods, drying has advantages and disadvantages. There are several advantages. Drying is simple. Foods take up less storage space and are easy to transport. Shelf life is long, dependent on product and storage temperature. It requires few supplies and equipment and a few added ingredients, and they can be limited in quantity, such as added sugar. Some of the disadvantages of drying food is that drying takes time and food must be checked throughout the process. Trays need to be shifted and food should be stirred, rearranged at specific time intervals, usually about every 30 minutes. Once the process starts, there should be no interruptions since this provides the opportunity for mold growth and spoilage. There will be some nutritional losses that take place during pre-treatment and processing. It can be expensive depending on the method and equipment used. Many fruits and vegetables are better if frozen or canned instead of dried. Avocados are not recommended for drying because of their high fat content. Seeds and fruit make them undesirable for drying, but are fine for fruit leathers. Citrus fruits are too juicy and the pulp does not have a firm enough texture. Crab apples are too small and tart, but you can combine them with other fruit for leather. Guavas have flesh that is full of seeds, but can be combined with other fruit for leather. Olives have a high oil content and a bitter flavor when dried. Pomegranates have too many seeds in the pulp. Broccoli, lettuce, radishes, and winter squash are not recommended for drying due to water content may be too high. They may have surfaces or layers that are difficult to dry. The flavor may be undesirable, or you may end up with a product of poor quality. Leafy greens dry poorly, as well as Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, celery, and cucumbers. Characteristics of some foods that make them unsuitable for drying are water content, fat content, seed content, and flavor. Freezing is the last method of preserving food we are going to talk about. Freezing is one of the easiest and least time-consuming ways to preserve food. Advantages of freezing are that many foods can be frozen. Their natural color, flavor, and nutritional value can be retained. Texture is usually better than for any other methods of preserving foods. But this is, of course, a personal preference. Foods can be frozen in less time than they can be dried or canned. Disadvantages of freezing are texture of some foods is undesirable because of changes due to the freezing process. Initial investment and cost of maintaining a freezer is high. Storage space is limited by how much the freezer will hold. Some foods that do not freeze well are lettuce, cabbage, celery, and cucumbers. Changes are also less noticeable in high-starch vegetables such as peas, corn, and lima beans. These foods freeze well. Some fruits and vegetables require blanching during the process. Blanching is scalding vegetables in boiling water or steam for a short time. It is a must for almost all vegetables that are to be frozen. It stops enzyme actions which cause loss of flavor, color, and texture. Blanching also cleanses the surface of the vegetable to remove soil and organisms. Blanching brightens the color of the vegetable. It delays the loss of vitamins. It also wilts or softens vegetables to make them easier to pack. How much blanching depends on the vegetable and size. Under blanching stimulates activity of enzymes and is worse than no blanching. Over blanching causes loss of flavor, color, vitamins, and minerals. Preserve your foods using modern recommended processes and tested recipes, and they will be safe and maintain their quality for several months. For best quality, preserve what you will consume in 1 year. Over time, preserved food loses quality. For more information about preserving foods, you can contact Starla Harden at the UT-TSU Extension Office in Murray County, Myra Walker at the UT-TSU Extension Office in Giles County, or Stacy Clark at the UT-TSU Extension Office in Lawrence County.
Any questions that anybody has about that presentation or about canning or preserving foods at all?
Lacey, there's nothing in the chat box, but if there's anybody here that has a question, just unmute yourself and fire away.